This video is sponsored by Envato Elements.
Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial. Now in this video I'm going to, for once, try not to destroy something because quite honestly it's been getting a little bit expensive to constantly have to... Well, now that we're here already, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to create a wall destruction effect in Blender and then composite that effect onto your video using Adobe After Effects. Now this is part 4 of my 3D integration series that shows you how to create 3D elements in Blender and composite them onto your videos using Adobe After Effects, and I will assume that you have watched all previous parts of that series. If you haven't yet, the links to those tutorials are going to be down in the video description, so be sure to check them out first before you come back here, otherwise this one might seem all sorts of confusing. But now, before anyone has any more chance to put holes into any other walls, let's jump right into the tutorial. Walter!
Before we jump into it, I want to give a big shout out to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video and helping me pay the bills. Envato Elements is a massive online resource offering over 55 million digital assets to kickstart your next creative project. They have everything from graphic and video templates for your favorite tools such as Premiere Pro, After Effects, DaVinci Resolve and others, to stock footage, graphic elements, music tracks, sound effects, 3D models, fonts, website templates and a ton more. They're offering a really simple licensing model that gives you full commercial rights to any asset you download, with some reasonable clauses like you can't resell them of course, and this license remains valid even after your subscription has ended. You can sign up to either a monthly or an annual subscription, both giving you access to an unlimited number of resources across all of the assets, and I'll drop you a special link down in the video description that will give you 50% off if you choose the annual plan. And if you're unsure, why not try it out and sign up for a free account? You get 12 free assets every month and you can upgrade your plan at any point you want. But now, let's return to the regular program.
Welcome to Blender. Now, there are two parts to creating this visual effect. The first one is creating the actual 3D destruction effect in Blender, and then the second part is taking this destruction effect and compositing it onto your original footage in Adobe After Effects. Now for this tutorial, I'm not going to show you every single button click. I really just want to show you how I put this together, some consideration, and give you ideas for how to put this together yourself. However, in the video description you will find download links to the project files, both for Blender as well as for Adobe After Effects, including the base footage. The only thing I'm not going to include are the actual render files of the 3D scene in Blender, because altogether they make up a little bit over 10 GB, and that's going to make for a pretty massive download. However, I will include instruction on how to render this out yourself. For me, this took overnight, but once you've rendered all of these files out and combine them with the project files as well as the base footage that you will be able to download from our website, you will be able to have a first-hand look at how I've put all of this together. Now, before I started creating the 3D destruction effect in Blender itself, I actually started out in Adobe After Effects, and I just started out with this simple clip of me here in front of a wall just talking and pretending like Walter smashes through it. And in order to create a 3D destruction effect that matches this footage, we need to reconstruct this scene in 3D. I've done that here in Blender, so that's the back wall, the side wall, the floor, and then obviously the place where Walter smashes through. And I'm not going to go over how I've created this physics simulation or the destruction. I have covered that in detail in the previous parts in the series, and as I said, I will assume that you've watched those. Now, the one question I did get on those previous parts is how do you make just a part of the wall destructible? And this back wall here, I've essentially just cut this little hole out, and then I've only fragmented that hole. However, if you go forward, you can then also see that some of the pieces kind of stick on the edges of this hole. And what I've done after I've created my destruction, and by the way this explodes is same as in my previous tutorial, I just got this impact sphere here, which isn't being rendered, which is just a sphere that kind of smashes through it. Let's just hide that again. And the other thing I've done is I've kind of selected a whole bunch of these pieces here on the edges of this destruction effect, and in the physics settings, these are all set to passive, so the fragments on the outside don't move, which then leave this really nice kind of broken piece in the wall. If you look through the camera, this is kind of set up to match the geometry in our 3D scene. And if you come into the cameras, select the camera object, and in here enable the background image, you can see it's kind of matched up with me right there, so I can see where that hole is being punched through the wall. And as with all physics simulations in Blender, if you want to render them out as an animation, do make sure that you come into your scene properties and in that rigid body world, bake those physics simulations in. Otherwise, every single frame in your animation will just show the first frame of that animation. You can also convert the physics simulation to keyframes and apply them as keyframes to every single object, which means you don't even need the physics simulation anymore once you're happy with that final animation and how it looks. But that's kind of the basic setup just of that destruction. And yes, the wall already starts out fractured. Another question I get over and over, and I have a video that shows how to deal with this. You can either fix it in Blender by swapping out an unbroken piece for the shattered piece of the wall. Or what I usually do, because I do my compositing in Adobe After Effects, I can just cover this up in compositing until the actual destruction happens. And yes, I know that Blender has an inbuilt compositor, which isn't bad, but it's quite limited compared to something like Adobe After Effects or Nuke or Fusion or a dedicated video compositing program. So I prefer to do my compositing outside of Blender, but you can use any tool that you like. Let's just come back into the camera and disable that background image again. Now, one thing you may struggle with a little bit once you've rendered your objects out and you're trying to composite everything is the color of the pieces may not match your base footage. Yes, you can use curves and color correction and all sorts of effects to make it all blend together a bit nicer. And because it's quite a wild effect with smoke and other stuff on top, it's not quite as noticeable. But one thing I usually like to do is I usually like to grab a single frame from my video, or you can just create a clean plate as well if you want to, which is just a single image where you're not in the shot and nothing else is obstructing the view of the object that you want to destroy. And then in Blender, I've actually assigned that material to all of my pieces as well as the back wall. And I used the camera to project my UVs onto the wall. So it's essentially, from the camera's point of view, that background image is essentially projected. So this shot will match exactly onto my base footage. So if I select one of the fragments in here and I come into the Material tab, I've got this projected material in here that as the base color will simply use that image, that frame that I've shown you, which is just this static image here. So what I essentially did, I selected all of the pieces of my back wall that I wanted to have that texture in, and then in UV editing, in the 3D view, make sure you're in that camera view, and then at the top under UV, you can actually project from view, which will essentially project the UVs from the current point of view, which is the camera, and so it's kind of like projecting that image that we've exported onto the back wall and over all of the pieces of our destruction effect. And so then finally, when you render this out, this will much closer match the actual footage you're trying to composite all of those 3D elements into. Now let's go into rendered view, and I've kind of set this up in a way that you can see all of the elements. Now let's select the side, the back, and the base wall. And I don't actually want to see this geometry. I actually just want to use this as a shadow catcher. So let's enable the shadow catcher. And by the way, if you change any properties in the properties panel, but you want to apply it to all of the selected objects, you can actually just right click any property in here and select copy to selected. And that property will be propagated to anything you have selected, which is super useful. So now if I look through the camera, I can kind of see that back wall and the destruction effect. And the way I rendered this out in order to be able to composite this, and this might depend a little bit on your scenarios, is in two parts. First, I rendered out just a single image of this fragmented hole itself because I needed that to stay in the background as all of the destruction happens in the foreground. For that, I simply turned off all of the fragments and just rendered this out just by itself. If I go to After Effects, I've got a wall hole color comp here, and all that is really just this hole here. I've got also an ambient occlusion pass, which just adds the shadow, and I've just blended the color in just a little bit nicer. But that's the first piece I rendered out, and it's just a single image. And then the second thing I did is I rendered out the full animation for the fragments only. So I enabled all of the fragments. I didn't just hide the fixed fragments. What I actually did is I turned all of the fragments into shadow catchers themselves. So you can simply right click onto the fixed fragments, say select objects. In the object properties, on the shadow catcher, make sure that is enabled, right click and go copy that to selected. So all of the static fragmented pieces of that are now just shadow catchers. And so now all you're seeing is that destruction effect itself. And the reason to turn the fixed pieces into a shadow catcher rather than just hiding them from the render is that you don't actually want to see the pieces that are falling onto the other side, to the back wall of that. And if you don't have the shadow catcher enabled on these pieces, you'll actually see the fragments fall on both sides. So you can essentially see through that, which is not what we want. So that's kind of the base. And then I rendered that out into a EXR sequence. Now I haven't covered EXR files specifically. If you go into the output settings and come down a little bit, you'll see that this is set to be an OpenEXR multi-layer file. And I really like this format because it allows you to include different render passes for shadow, for the diffuse light, for ambient occlusion, for mist or Z-depth into the same file. And then you can extract those different layers in Adobe After Effects. So you don't have to have thousands of files for all of these different passes. They can all be embedded inside the same file. If you don't really know how to work with these, just drop me a comment down below. I'm happy to make a tutorial for that. In the view layer properties, you can define which passes you actually want to include in the output data. And I included the combined render pass, a mist pass, the normal pass, diffuse light, as well as the shadow, ambient occlusion, and the shadow catch-up passes. Let's render out this particular frame, and it's still going on, but you can see this is our combined layer, and it's rendered out on a transparent background, again, like I showed you in previous parts of this tutorial series. However, under this combined dropdown, you can actually select all of the different passes. We have a normal pass that will actually allow us to relight those 3D elements in a video compositing tool, such as Adobe After Effects. I didn't end up using it, but it's useful to have in there. We have the ambient occlusion pass. We have one for just the shadow. And then one that is really useful is this mist pass here. Essentially, objects further away get more and more diffuse. They're kind of more and more getting that misty color. This looks very similar to a Z-depth pass, which is essentially a grayscale image that denotes the distance of your 3D objects from the camera. And you can set up Z-depth passes and render them out in Blender. There's even an option here for the Z-depth pass. However, Z-depth passes in Blender by default aren't anti-aliased. They do look a bit rough, so I prefer using the mist pass. But again, just do whatever makes you happy. So I've got all of these different layers in here. Then under the render settings, I do usually enable motion blur. I obviously have the transparent background. And under sampling, I usually like to enable denoising with the Open Image Denoiser. It just makes that final image look a little bit cleaner. Under the Advanced tab in the sampling category, make sure you enable the little stopwatch icon next to the seed so that any noise you get in your render won't look static and it moves a little bit. It'll fit more organically on any footage that you may have, because that's going to have just a little bit of grain in it by itself. And then finally, I just rendered out this entire sequence to my hard drive, all SEXR files, each of them about 20 to 30 megabytes each. So that's the sequence for all of the destruction, and then have that single EXR called wall hole EXR file, which is just the fragmented outline of the wall. And with that, let's jump into After Effects and I'll show you how I composited everything back together onto that original footage. This is the final effect in Adobe After Effects. There's quite a lot going on. You can see that just before the destruction happens, you can see a little bit of a crack. And then everything kind of comes into place. Now you can see that the color doesn't 100% match. And I've tried and played around with it for quite a while, but because the camera shake, the dust, the dirt, and because the explosion goes towards the camera, it's actually quite hard to pick up unless you really look closely. So I was actually pretty happy with the final composite. Now, in order to create this effect, I imported the rendered out files. Sitting here under the 3D folder, there's my destruction EXR sequence as well as my wall underscore hole EXR. Now in Adobe After Effects, unfortunately, you can't just dump in EXR files and hope that they'll work. I would love if After Effects supported this natively, but it does not. However, there are 2 free plugins that you can use for exactly that. The first one is called OpenEXR. Again, I'll drop you the link down in the video description. You can just download this plugin. This allows you to essentially import an EXR file, apply this effect, and then in the effect, you can select the layer, the actual render pass that you want to see, whether that is the shadow, the ambient occlusion, the diffuse, the normal pass, or anything else you may have rendered out. The other one that I also found super useful is this OpenColor.io for After Effects. Because when you render an EXR file in Blender and you just use it in After Effects with the OpenEXR plugin, the colors will look very different. Because of the color profile conversion, it doesn't quite work too nicely. So I've also used this OpenColor.io effect, and you will need both of those if you want to open the project. Other than that, I'm not using any third-party plugins, but these two, which you can get for free, I have used to do the final composite. So for example, there's this fragments color comp right here, and down here I've imported my fragments right here, and on this layer in the effect controls you'll see I've got the extractor effect, and you can see the layer I'm using is this combined layer, and if you pop this open you can see ambient occlusion, combined, diffuse, mist, normal, shadow, anything you've rendered out from Blender, and then you can select, I want to render out the mist pass, for example, which obviously I don't want to. And then after that, at least on the combined pass, in order to fix the color, I've applied this OpenColor.io. So this is kind of what it looks like by default. Let me just make the composition background black, just so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So this is without OpenColor.io. Then I've applied that and it kind of normalizes it back. So that's super useful, but you will need these plugins if you want to work with EXR files in Adobe After Effects. So that's essentially for the fragment layer, and then you can see the whole fragments animation in here. It is a little bit slow because the files are quite big, and After Effects isn't the most efficient in working with the EXR files because, again, you need plugins to actually work with them. And then I also have a wall hole color comp here, which is really just that hole of the wall, and it's just a static image. Now I have added the clean plate on top and applied it in color mode just to kind of tweak that color a little bit closer towards the final image that I'm compositing it into, and just made it a bit easier to then get the colors on the edges right. Now I've nested these in other comps. So for example, the wall hole comp is essentially, if I hide that background element, it's really just that hole again with the additional color on the edge just to blend it a bit better into the background. And then I've just added this whole mat here to kind of just soften the edges and cut that out just so it would composite a little bit nicer onto the final shot. The other things I did as well on these ones here, I've kind of just tweaked the color with curves a little bit. And if you jump into them, especially on this wall hole outline here, I've added a noise effect because I wanted to animate some noise onto it, because otherwise it's just a static image and it would look a little bit artificial. Let's return to the project, and most of the action happens in the 001 intro comp. So if you pop this open, this is kind of where most of the compositing and most of the actual effects are put together. This intro wall fix comp is really just the basic footage of me standing in front of the wall, and then I've just cut a hole in where the actual hole should be. Underneath that, I've got the Walter roto comp, which is really just the background here. And this actually includes Walter coming up and pretending to hammer. The other thing I've composited down into the background as well is this debris fall 02 MOV. Unfortunately, I will not be able to include these stock footage files in the downloads themselves, simply because they're licensed to Video Copilot. They come from the Action Essentials 2 package that you can purchase on their website. It's $99 for a whole bunch of different elements. Super useful. They're not the most modern anymore or the highest quality. If you want highest quality, I highly recommend you check out actionvfx.com, which have some absolutely mind-blowing action stock footage. And by the way, if you want to support my channel and get a little bit of a discount, you can use my coupon code SurfacedStudio in one word, and you'll knock 10% off that final price. But anyways, just wanted to let you know that unfortunately I cannot include these stock footage elements, but they are composited into the final scene to add a bit of debris trickling down after Walter destroyed everything. Then I composited the wall hole itself, and there's like a little layer here called wall appearing. It's very short, but it just makes it a little bit less abrupt of when that entire effect appears. And then the whole thing falls apart. Again, you can see just a little bit of a mismatch of color. I could have tweaked it more, but because the effect is pretty short, and then with color correction and the camera shake, it wasn't all that visible. Next, I've then composited all of the fragments on top of all of that. And on top of that, some more stock footage for a dust wave. Now that doesn't happen until all of these pieces are kind of dropping to the floor, and then all of that dust happens here. On top of that, I've then rendered the shadows for all of these fragments. Actually, they should probably be sitting underneath the dust wave, so the elements in the front of the dust wave are just a little bit brighter. Then a few more dust hit elements on top of that. And in here, you see the mist pass being used, and I've done that previously in some of the compositing. Let's just kind of hide all of that. Now, what this mist pass essentially allows me to do is it allows me to place this dust wave in front or behind these 3D elements for the fragment. So if I show all of these fragment pieces, this mist pass here, which is kind of the depth, so it shows the depth of the 3D elements from the camera, I can adjust how close or how far I want that shadow to show in front of these pieces. If I show the fragments themselves, this allows me to define how deep in my 3D elements this stock footage layer, which is 2D, kind of sits. Let's just undo that. But that's why these mist passes are super, super useful. Usually what I'll do is I'll use an extractor effect to extract the mist depth layer, and then I usually use an extractor effect to kind of just trim it off of, how far into the back or how far towards the front do I want to show this element. It's super useful. It's a very simple technique, but it just makes it so much easier to composite stock footage with your 3D elements. So I always recommend render out a mist pass on top of that. And then on the layer that sits underneath the mist pass, I usually just set the track matte to alpha inverted. Let me just unsolo that so we can kind of see that final effect. Let's just zoom out. And finally, I've just added a little bit of color grading on top of it, just to bake everything back together. And again, color grading all of your composited layers at the very end. I'll just use the simple Lumetri color. I think I just used the creative effect, added a little bit of vignetting effect. You can play with the curves and the color in any way you want, or use other plugins to create effects. Again, I didn't want to go too far down that route. I just wanted to bind all of these layers that I've composited a little bit more organically together, and just adding a final color grading on top usually does all of that. Then I pre-composed all of these layers, and that's what you have in the 001 intro composition. And on here, you press U to reveal some keyframes. I've got a slider controller and a motion tile, and it just adds just a little bit of camera shake just to emphasize the moment of impact when Walter destroys everything. And you've seen this technique used plenty of times before. And that's pretty much the end-to-end workflow that I used to create this visual effect. Now, I know I didn't go into every single detail, and if you found something a little bit confusing or too fast, or you think I didn't go in-depth enough, do drop me some comments down below. I'm super happy to make more tutorials for this, but hopefully this is enough to get you started and kind of see through the end-to-end process of how to create a destruction effect in Blender and composite it back onto your original footage in Adobe After Effects. So hopefully you at least got something useful out of this tutorial.
And that is all there is to it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to watch more, just click these links over on the right hand side. If you want to support me, what I do on this channel, be sure to check out all of the links down in the video description. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.